Snow fell gently over the city, softening the sharp edges of a Christmas Eve that felt too loud and too empty. The kind of snow that looked beautiful from a distance, but soaked through your shoes if you stood still too long. Ethan Miller stood outside a downtown office tower, tightening the scarf around his neck as Lucy tugged on his gloved hand. She was 6, small for her age, wrapped in a puffy red coat that made her look like a moving ornament. Her breath puffed into the air as she looked up at him with tired eyes. "Can we go home now, Dad?" Ethan forced a smile. "Yeah, sweetheart. We're done." They had left early. Again. The company Christmas gala was still going strong upstairs. Champagne, speeches, laughter that echoed but didn't land. Ethan had shaken hands, accepted compliments, posed for photos. CEO of a billion-dollar tech company. A success story. But none of that mattered when Lucy's shoulders started to slump and her fingers grew cold. Since his wife died 3 years ago, Ethan had learned to read the smallest signs. A yawn held too long. A quiet that meant exhaustion, not peace. Being a single father didn't come with instructions, only instincts sharpened by love and fear. As they walked down the street, Lucy slowed, pointing to a small cafe tucked between 2 old brick buildings. Warm yellow light spilled from its windows. A modest Christmas tree stood inside, decorated with wooden stars and mismatched ribbons. "That place looks cozy," she said, hopeful. Ethan hesitated. He had emails waiting, calls he'd ignored. A quiet apartment that still smelled faintly like pine cleaner and memories. "Hot cocoa?" Lucy added, almost whispering, as if afraid the idea might disappear. He exhaled, nodded. "All right, cocoa." The bell above the cafe door chimed softly as they stepped inside. The air was warm, sweet with cinnamon and coffee. A few people sat scattered around, an older couple sharing pie, a man reading near the window, a tired barista wiping down the counter. Lucy slipped off her mittens and wrapped her hands around a mug the moment it arrived. Her shoulders relaxed. Ethan watched her, feeling that familiar ache in his chest. The mix of gratitude and guilt that came with raising a child alone. He wondered, not for the first time, if he was doing enough. If showing up was really enough. Then somewhere near the back of the cafe, a piano key pressed down. One note, soft, uncertain. Ethan looked up, and everything he thought he'd buried long ago began to stir. The note hung in the air longer than it should have, thin and fragile, like it wasn't sure it belonged there. Then another followed, and another. Ethan straightened in his chair. The piano sat near the back wall, half shadowed by the Christmas tree lights. A small girl, no older than 5, perched on the bench with her feet dangling above the floor. Her fingers moved carefully, pressing each key with deliberate focus, as if the song mattered more than getting it right. Lucy stopped stirring her cocoa. She tilted her head, listening. Her brow creased in that way it always did when she tried to understand something big. "Dad," she whispered, leaning closer, "that song feels sad, but not scary sad, warm sad." Ethan's chest tightened. He knew that melody. Not the polished version, not a recording. This one was imperfect, slower, uneven, but the bones of it were unmistakable. Every rise and fall, every pause that carried more emotion than sound. His hands curled around the edge of the table. 12 years ago, on the steps outside a college music hall, a girl with ink-smudged fingers and big dreams had played that song just for him. She laughed when she messed up, told him it wasn't finished yet, said it was about hope finding its way back. No one else had ever heard it. The little girl missed a note, hesitated, then kept going. She didn't stop. She trusted the music to carry her through. Ethan swallowed hard. Lucy slid off her chair and padded closer, standing a few feet from the piano. She didn't speak. She just listened, hands clasped in front of her coat, eyes wide and gentle. When the final note faded, the cafe stayed quiet for a heartbeat too long. Then a few soft claps followed. The girl beamed, cheeks pink with pride, and hopped down from the bench. Lucy turned back to Ethan, her voice hushed but certain. "I think that song remembers someone." Ethan couldn't move, because in that moment, he realized the song hadn't just remembered someone. It had found him. The quiet broke when a voice called gently from behind the counter. "Mia, honey, grab your coat. We're about to close." Ethan's breath caught. He didn't need to turn around to know that voice. Time seemed to tilt. The cafe sounds dulling, as if someone had pressed a hand over his ears. Still, he turned. Claire Reynolds stepped into view, drying her hands on a worn kitchen towel. She looked different, older, thinner, grounded in a way she hadn't been before. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, strands falling free around her face. No stage lights, no college notebooks, just a faded sweater, tired eyes, and the quiet strength of someone who had learned how to survive. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. 12 years collapsed into a single heartbeat. Late-night talks, half-finished songs, promises spoken too easily back then, and the sudden silence that had followed, sharp and unresolved. Mia ran past them, tugging on her coat, oblivious. "Did you hear? People clapped," she said proudly. "You were wonderful," Claire replied, brushing crumbs from her daughter's sleeve. Then she looked back at Ethan. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said. Her voice was calm but guarded, careful, like someone stepping around old cracks in the floor. Ethan stood slowly. "I didn't expect to be," he admitted. Lucy slipped closer to his side, her small hand finding his. She looked from Ethan to Claire, then to Mia, reading the room with a child's quiet intuition. Claire's gaze softened slightly when she noticed Lucy. "Your daughter?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan said. "Lucy." Lucy offered a shy smile. "Hi." Mia waved back. "I'm Mia." Something shifted then. Not dramatic, not loud. Just a subtle change in the air. Two adults carrying unfinished history. Two children standing in the open space between them. Claire glanced toward the piano, then back at Ethan. "You still recognize that song," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Ethan nodded once. "I never forgot it." Claire looked down for a moment, steadying herself. "Neither did I." The cafe lights hummed quietly above them. And just like that, the past was no longer buried. It was standing right there, asking what they were going to do next. The tension didn't break with words. It softened in smaller ways. Lucy drifted back toward the piano, curiosity pulling her forward. Mia followed, her earlier nerves gone now, replaced by the easy confidence of a child who felt seen. They sat side by side on the bench, their legs swinging in uneven rhythm. "You play really brave," Lucy said, studying the keys like they were something alive. Mia grinned. "I mess up a lot." "That's okay," Lucy replied. "My dad says you don't stop just because it gets hard." Ethan felt that land somewhere deep in his chest. The girls pressed random keys together, laughing when the notes clashed. Not music yet, just sound, just shared space. Two children doing what children do best, building connection without permission. Across the room, Claire watched them, arms loosely folded. She glanced at Ethan. "She doesn't usually play for strangers," she said quietly. "She didn't feel like one," Ethan answered before thinking. Claire studied him for a moment, then nodded as if that made sense. Lucy leaned toward Mia, lowering her voice like it was a secret. "It's just me and my dad at home." Mia didn't hesitate. "It's just me and my mom." The girls exchanged a look, simple, honest understanding. After a beat, Mia added, "Do you ever wish your house was louder?" Lucy smiled. "Sometimes." "Me too." They bumped shoulders, an unspoken agreement sealed. Claire exhaled slowly. Ethan noticed the way her posture eased, just a little. The past still sat between them, heavy and unresolved. But something else had joined it now. Something lighter. Hope didn't arrive with grand gestures. It slipped in quietly, wearing mismatched mittens and carrying cocoa-sticky hands. When Claire finally spoke again, her voice was softer. "We're here most weekends," she said. "Mia has lessons in the afternoons." Ethan met her eyes. He understood what she was offering. Not forgiveness, not a reunion. Just space. "I'd like that," he said. Lucy looked back at him, eyes bright. "Can we come again, Dad?" Ethan smiled, real this time. "Yeah, kiddo, we can." The piano keys chimed softly as the girls played on, unaware that in their easy laughter, something fragile and important had begun to take shape. Not a family. Not yet. But the possibility of one. Ethan told himself he was only stopping by the cafe for Lucy. That was the explanation he repeated in his head the following Saturday, and the one after that. Lucy had piano lessons now. Nothing formal, just Claire showing her where to place her fingers, how to listen instead of rush. Ethan sat at the same small table near the window, a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hands, answering emails he didn't really read. Each week, he stayed a little longer. He watched Claire move through the cafe with practiced efficiency, balancing warmth and exhaustion in equal measure. She knew every regular by name. She wiped tables with quiet care. This wasn't the life she'd once dreamed of, but it was a life she had built, brick by brick, for her daughter. Lucy and Mia grew comfortable in each other's orbit. They shared sheet music, snacks, secrets whispered between wrong notes. Sometimes Lucy leaned over and asked questions meant for adults, the kind that carried weight without realizing it. "Does it ever stop feeling lonely?" she asked once. Claire paused, then answered honestly. "It gets easier when you're not alone in it." Ethan felt the truth of that settle in his bones. One afternoon, as snow began to fall again outside the windows, Mia stumbled over a section of a song and groaned in frustration. She dropped her hands to her lap. Claire knelt beside her. "Hey," she said gently, "we don't quit because it's hard. We take a breath and try again." Mia nodded, wiping her eyes, and played on. Ethan recognized the lesson. He'd taught Lucy the same way. Different words, same meaning. Later, as they gathered their coats, Ethan spoke before he could overthink it. "We'll be back next weekend," he said. Claire looked up, surprised, then smiled just enough to show she meant it. "We'll be here." Walking out into the cold, Lucy slipped her hand into his and squeezed. "Dad," she said, matter of fact, "I like this place." Ethan looked back through the cafe window where Claire and Mia laughed over a missed note. So did he. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't passing through something good. He was learning how to stay. The cafe was quieter than usual that afternoon. A slow Tuesday, Claire had said. Fewer customers, more time. Snow pressed softly against the windows, turning the street outside into something distant and unreal. Mia was in the back, coloring at a small table, her legs tucked under the chair. Lucy sat beside her, carefully choosing crayons like the decision mattered. Ethan stood near the counter, unsure whether to stay or step outside. Claire broke the silence first. "You always hated winter," she said lightly, though her eyes stayed on the espresso machine. "Said it made everything feel unfinished." Ethan smiled faintly. "I was impatient back then." She nodded. "We both were." The words hung there, waiting. After a moment, Claire turned toward him. Her voice lowered. "You never asked why I left." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I wanted to. I didn't know how." She took a breath, steady but deliberate. "My mom got sick. Stage 4. It happened fast." Her fingers curled around the edge of the counter. "Hospitals, bills, appointments. I was 19 and suddenly responsible for everything." Ethan said nothing. He didn't trust his voice. "I didn't disappear because I stopped loving you," she continued. "I left because I didn't want you to watch me fall apart. You were building something. I didn't want to be the weight that pulled you down." Something in Ethan cracked, quietly, deeply. "I would have stayed," he said. "Stayed," he said. "I know," Claire replied softly, "and that scared me more than being alone." In the corner, Mia laughed at something Lucy said, unaware of the confession unfolding a few feet away. Claire glanced toward her daughter, her expression fierce and tender all at once. "After my mom died, there was no going back. And then Mia came." She swallowed. "Life just kept moving." Ethan understood then, not the details, but the cost. He nodded once. "I spent years thinking you chose silence over me." "I chose survival," she said. "There's a difference." They stood there, two people finally speaking truths that had aged inside them. The past didn't disappear, but for the first time it felt lighter. It started with a fever. Claire noticed it just after dinner, when Mia leaned her head against the table and didn't complain about not finishing her soup. By bedtime, her skin was too warm, her breath shallow and uneven. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, pressing a cool cloth to her daughter's forehead, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. By midnight, panic set in. She called the urgent care clinic down the street, full. The children's hospital across town had space, but the receptionist's tone shifted the moment she mentioned insurance. Claire hung up, heart pounding, staring at the dark hallway of her apartment. Her hands shook as she opened her phone. She didn't remember deciding to call Ethan. She only remembered his name lighting up the screen and the sound of her own voice breaking when he answered. I don't know what to do," she said. He was at her door 20 minutes later. Ethan didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He lifted Mia carefully, wrapping her in his coat like she was made of glass. Lucy followed close behind, quiet, clutching her stuffed bear with both arms. At the hospital, everything moved fast. Nurses, monitors, clipped voices. Mia was admitted with a respiratory infection. Treatable, the doctor said, but serious enough to keep her overnight. Claire stood frozen beside the bed, one hand on Mia's hair, the other clenched tight at her side. In the hallway, Lucy sat next to Ethan on a plastic chair, her legs swinging nervously. "Is she going to be okay?" she whispered. "Yes," Ethan said steady. "She will." Lucy nodded, trusting him completely. Later, when the billing clerk mentioned costs Claire couldn't begin to cover, her face crumpled. Ethan stepped forward before she could speak. "I've got it," he said simply. "No conditions." Claire tried to protest, but the words fell apart into tears. That night, two little girls fell asleep in chairs pushed together outside a hospital room. And two adults learned something important. Love didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just showed up and stayed. Mia was recovering slowly, color returning to her cheeks day by day. By the time she was discharged, the worst of the fear had passed, but not the weight it left behind. A week later, the cafe was busy again. The clatter of mugs and low conversation filled the space, but Claire felt strangely distant, like she was moving through water. She had found the email that morning while cleaning out an old inbox, one she hadn't opened in years. The subject line stopped her cold. Submission review, not a fit. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled. 5 years ago, she had sent a demo under her initials, not her name. One song. Raw. Honest. The kind of music that comes from surviving something. She had hoped, quietly, foolishly, that it might matter on its own. The rejection came from Miller Tech Media, Ethan's company. When he walked in that afternoon, snow dusting his coat, Claire felt the air shift. She didn't greet him. She didn't smile. "Did you ever hear it?" she asked suddenly, her voice tight. Ethan blinked. "Hear what?" "My song," she said, pulling the printed email from her apron pocket. "The one I sent to your company." He read it in silence, his brow furrowing. "Claire, I've never seen this." "You're the CEO," she snapped, the hurt breaking through. "Your name is on everything." Ethan looked stunned. "I didn't know, I swear." She laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You walked away once before. Now I find out you turned your back on the only thing I had left." The words landed hard, heavier than she meant them to be. "I didn't turn my back," Ethan said quietly. "I never stopped listening." Claire shook her head. "I can't do this again. I can't let you in and risk losing everything." The cafe went quiet around them. And for the first time since he'd walked back into her life, Ethan stood on the edge of losing her all over again. The cafe felt smaller after that, like the walls had leaned in, listening. Ethan stood where Claire had left him, the rejection email folded loosely in his hand. He could have explained the corporate process, could have talked about submissions teams and filters, and how many decisions were made without him ever seeing a name. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the look on her face when she said she couldn't risk losing everything again. He waited until closing to speak to her. Claire was wiping down the counter, movements sharp and mechanical, like she needed the repetition to stay steady. Ethan approached slowly, giving her space, not disappearing, just staying. "I'm not here to argue," he said quietly, "or defend myself." She didn't look up. "I believe you didn't mean to hurt me," she replied. "But intention doesn't change impact." He nodded. "I know." Silence stretched between them, the kind that used to send him running, into work, into distractions, into anything that didn't ask him to feel. This time he stayed right where he was. "I walked away once," Claire continued, voice low. "I can't let that happen around my daughter." "Around me," Ethan swallowed. "Then don't." She finally looked at him. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said. "I'm asking you to watch me, to see what I do when things get uncomfortable." Claire's expression wavered, just for a second. "I can't promise anything," she said. "I'm not asking for promises," Ethan replied. "Just time." From the back of the cafe, a single piano key sounded. Soft, accidental. Mia had pressed it while climbing down from the bench. The note rang out, lonely but clear. Ethan glanced toward her, then back to Claire. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not this time." Claire didn't answer right away. But she didn't ask him to leave either. And in that quiet decision, in the space between fear and hope, something shifted. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the possibility that staying might finally be enough. The idea started small. A few flyers taped to the cafe window. A quiet post shared among regulars. A Christmas benefit for children and music. Nothing flashy, no press, no speeches. Just a room, a piano, and people who cared enough to show up. Claire didn't know Ethan had anything to do with it until the night of the event. The cafe looked different. Warmer somehow. Soft white lights lined the windows. Paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling. Chairs were arranged in careful rows, facing the piano that had been polished until its surface reflected the glow. Mia stood backstage, clutching her sheet music with both hands. Her red dress fluttered as she shifted her weight, nerves bubbling to the surface. "I don't think I can do it," she whispered. Claire knelt in front of her, resting her hands on Mia's knees. "You don't have to be perfect," she said gently. "You just have to play honestly." Mia nodded, swallowing hard. Lucy appeared beside them, holding the edge of the music binder. "I'll stay right here," she said, "in case the pages get scared." That earned a small laugh. When Mia walked out, the room fell quiet. She sat at the bench, feet dangling, took a breath, and began. The first notes of winter glow drifted through the cafe, uneven but full. Lucy stood beside her, carefully turning the pages, glancing up with quiet encouragement. No one spoke. No one moved. Ethan watched from the back, his chest tight. This wasn't the song he remembered. It was better. Because it wasn't about what had been lost. It was about what had survived. When the final note faded, the room stayed still for a heartbeat. Then applause rose, warm and unrestrained. Claire pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely now. Mia stood, beaming. And for the first time in a long while, the music didn't hurt. It healed. The cafe emptied slowly after the benefit, people lingering like they didn't want to break whatever had settled in the room. Chairs were folded, cups stacked, lights dimmed to a softer glow. Outside, snow began to fall again, quiet, unannounced. Mia sat on a stool near the counter, swinging her legs, still buzzing from the applause. Lucy stood beside her, holding 2 cookies she'd insisted on saving for later. They leaned their heads together, whispering and giggling like they'd known each other for years instead of weeks. Claire watched them, her chest tight in a way that felt unfamiliar. Not fear this time, something gentler. Ethan approached her without rushing, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. "She was incredible," he said, nodding toward Mia. Claire smiled, tired but proud. "She was brave. She learned that from you." She met his eyes, searching for something. Pressure, expectation, an unspoken ask. She found none. "There's something I want to offer," Ethan said carefully, "and you can say no." He explained the program simply. A small foundation initiative. Music lessons for kids who couldn't afford them. Community-based, local. He wanted Claire to lead it, not because of their history, but because she understood what it meant to keep going when the world said stop. "This isn't charity," he added, "it's respect." Claire took a long breath. The old version of her would have assumed strings. The woman she was now listened for truth. "Okay," she said softly. Across the room, Mia suddenly called out, "Mom?" Claire turned. "Yes, sweetheart." Mia pointed between Lucy and Ethan, then back at herself. "If we keep playing together, does that make us kind of a family?" Lucy didn't hesitate. She nodded. "I think it does." Ethan held his breath. Claire walked over and knelt in front of them. "Families aren't about who shows up first," she said gently. "They're about who stays." Mia smiled satisfied. And in that moment, without promises, without paperwork, something real took shape. Not perfect, not planned, but chosen. 1 year later, the cafe no longer felt like a place people stumbled into by accident. Warm lights framed the windows, glowing against the early winter dusk. A hand-painted sign near the door read, "Community Music Night. All welcome." Inside, the smell of cinnamon and fresh coffee wrapped around every conversation. Laughter traveled easily now, settling into the corners like it belonged there. Mia sat at the piano, her posture steadier, her fingers more confident. Lucy stood beside her, helping a younger child find middle C, patient in a way only kids who feel safe can be. Their heads leaned together as they whispered encouragement, their bond effortless and unforced. Ethan watched from a small table near the window, a paper cup of tea warming his hands. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't thinking about work. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. Claire moved through the room with calm assurance, greeting parents, adjusting sheet music, kneeling to speak at eye level with every child who needed reassurance. This wasn't the life she once imagined, but it was fuller than anything she had dared to hope for. Later, as the crowd thinned and coats were pulled on, Ethan helped stack chairs while the girls packed up music books. It was ordinary, quiet, and that was the miracle of it. Lucy slipped her hand into his and said softly, Dad, remember when it was just us? He nodded. I do. She smiled, and I like this better. Across the room, Mia ran to Claire and hugged her tight. Can we play the winter song again next week? Claire brushed hair from her daughter's face. Of course. When the door finally closed and the cafe fell silent, the four of them stood together beneath the soft glow of the lights. No speeches, no grand declarations, just a shared understanding. They had all been broken once. They had all been afraid to hope again. But love hadn't found them through perfect timing or big promises. It found them through presence, through choosing to stay on the hard days, through showing up again and again, even when it would have been easier to walk away. Outside, snow began to fall, slow, gentle, familiar. Ethan reached for Claire's hand. She didn't pull away. Mia and Lucy raced ahead on the sidewalk, laughing, their voices echoing into the night. A family not born but built. And now a question for you. Who in your life chose to stay when it would have been easier to leave? Or maybe more importantly, who are you choosing to stay for? If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the quiet power of love, music, and chosen family, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Your support helps us continue sharing heartfelt stories that celebrate healing, connection, and second chances. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes staying is the bravest choice of all.